Well, we'll hear from you what type of portals or accessibility options there are for people like us who could contribute that, and we'll add that into the description specifically for this case. But I do want to change the discussion again just to one of the last topics I want to talk about, where in 2016 you wrote an article called Why I Was Wrong About Christianity for the New Statesman, which is a very interesting discussion, talking about the influence that Christianity had in the development of many societies, but also among them the one we talked about in the Western society. Previously, you thought that Western values were derived from Greece and Rome, and you kind of didn't really own anything to Christianity. The context within the values that Greece and Rome perpetuated were Christianized, and therefore that's where the values came from. But you've since had a change of heart. Could you explain why you think it became core from Christianity rather than principles that already existed in Greece and Rome before Christianity?
Well, so I was writing books about Greece and particularly Rome. And actually it was on the most basic level that because I was writing in English, a European language, I found so many of the words that I wanted to use inadequate to sum up the world that I was describing. So words like religion, secular, homosexuality, science, all kinds of words carried a kind of a freight that risked becoming anachronistic. And I kept thinking, well, why? What has changed? And the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that essentially the impact of Christianity was so manifest that to speak English was, in a sense, to Christianize yourself.
Okay.
That the weight of signification that English words have are so shaped by Christianity that it can be almost impossible to apply them to pre-Christian civilizations. And the more I thought about that, the more I came to see that when I look back at Greece or Rome, it was like trying to peer through a kind of dust haze. And that dust haze was made up of kind of tiny little Christian particles. I could kind of dimly make out the lineaments, but it was a real effort to try and to get rid of them. And I wanted, so the article, what had I got wrong, was basically I hadn't realized how Christian I was.
Okay.
I had not realized how Christian I was in my assumptions, in my attitudes, in my morals, in the most basic way that I understood and saw the world. So I'll give you an example, which is a word that might seem impeccably Greek and have nothing to do with Christianity, which is democracy. So people say, it's people power. Yeah. That's how it's translated. And so people
history
look
in Athens. It's very Greek.
So it comes, associated with Athens in the late 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC in Greece. And we assume that there's a continuity between the democracy practiced by the Athenians and the democracy that we have in the modern world. And so we look back at ancient Greece and we say, but what about the slaves? What about the foreigners? What about the women? They didn't have a vote, so therefore it couldn't really be a democracy. And in doing that, we are assuming that the Athenian democracy was founded on certain principles, namely that everyone has a kind of right to, they have rights, that's what underpins democracy, your democratic right to a vote. And that's the logic that in 20th century meant that women were given the right to vote. It's what underpinned, obviously in South Africa, the extension of the franchise to everyone in South Africa. There is no slave or free. There is no Greek or Jew. There is no man or woman. There is no black or white. Everyone is equal. This is a Christian perspective. It's founded on the idea that all human beings have a fundamental dignity. But that's not what democracy in Athens was about. It's not the founding principle. Actually, it's better to think of it as the power of the demos. And what is the demos? The demos to the Athenians is the sum of people who are sprung from the soil of Attica in the present, in the past, and in the future. And they have a sacral bond to the earth that has given them birth and to the gods that look after them. And everybody who belongs to that demos has a role to play. And the role of men is to fight and to legislate. So that's why they have their votes. That's why they sit in the assembly. That's why women don't go. But women also have their role, which is to mediate with the gods and above all with the goddess Athena, who gives her name to the city of Athens. And for the Athenians, that's just as important as sitting in the assembly, perhaps even more important. And so the premise that we bring as people shaped by Christianity is one that struggles massively to come to terms with that, because we don't think to look at it in those terms. And so we sit in judgment on the Athenians for denying women or slaves the vote. But to the Athenians, it would have seemed perfectly obvious why they were doing that. But you have to think yourself back into a pre-Christian frame of mind properly to get that. And it's that degree of effort, because I think, to be honest, one of the things that being kind of globally hegemonic as Europeans have been, and perhaps particularly if you're an English speaker from Britain or from America, you've had 2 centuries of being able to assume that your values and your ideals and the way that you see the world is just the natural order of things. That's just the way things are. I think that as Western power retreats, that becomes less and less the case. I think that more and more we in the West will come to understand that our way of seeing the world is just one way of many different ways, and that actually, our values, our assumptions, our ideals are very, very contingent, culturally contingent. But I think that for the past 2 centuries, that's been, we've been able to coast by, assuming that the way that we see the world is just the way things are. And I don't think that's the case. And I think that in our essence, the way that we see the world is shaped above all by Christianity. And that doesn't mean that you have to believe in God, doesn't mean you have to go to church, doesn't mean that you even have to really know anything at all about Christianity. But it does mean that it's kind of like, those particles of dust that I talked about, that you just breathe them in, and you may not even realize that you're breathing them in, but there they are. It's part of the oxygen that you're breathing in.
Is it then fundamentally in the same way that Christianity seems to be quite shrinking in terms of Western society as a popular, methodology, way of thinking, religious perspective? Is that the same way connected to a way that the Western way of thinking is this is just the way that the world works is also shrinking, and perhaps even more of a different world's perspective, whether that be African or Eastern hemisphere? Is that also the reason why they might be gaining?
No, I think Christianity isn't shrinking globally. Okay. I mean, in Africa, it's spread like wildfire.
Right.
Since the 50s. I mean, its growth has been of an astonishing rate, and it's spreading like wildfire in parts of Asia. And I use wildfire because the fastest growing denomination of Christianity of all is Pentecostalism. And Pentecostal, it's the fire of Pentecost, the fire of the Spirit coming down. It's that idea of kind of living fire spreading around the world. Very, very important and transformative. It's along with radical Islam, Pentecostalism is the great transformative 21st century kind of cultural movement. But I think in the West, in the West, definitely there's the feeling that it's shrinking because more and more people kind of define themselves as being not just post-Christian but anti-Christian. But I think that the kind of strident atheism that we see often in the West is just another form of kind of Christianity. It's a logical endpoint for the campaign that Christianity has always embodied against what it casts as superstition, against idolatry, against the belief that there's the divine in shrubs or springs or mountaintops or whatever. That ultimately goes back to the Hebrew prophets. That conviction that you should get rid of superstition ultimately has turned on Christianity itself, but it's bred of Christian assumptions, I think. And so that means that essentially the West remains absolutely shot through with a Christian way of seeing the world. because the things that it doesn't believe in are very Christian things.
Yeah. No, exactly.
So therefore, you can be shaped by what you lack. That can define you. And I think that what we lack and what we reject is Christian, and so therefore we remain defined by it.
No, exactly. Okay, yeah. That's a very interesting perspective. I never actually thought about the one actually causing the other one, and